So The Professor was the last book from Charlotte Bronte that I had yet to read. And having recently finished Shirley, I thought I might give it a try. Because, you see, I went into Shirley not expecting much, simply because it wasn't as famous as Jane Eyre or Villette. And yet it turned out to be another masterpiece. So I thought perhaps The Professor could be the same, so I gave it a try. But having finished reading it a couple of days ago, I'm afraid to say that it was a bit of a disappointment. Now, I know that in this video I'm going to focus mostly on all the negative things that I did not like in the book. But I don't want to give the impression that I didn't enjoy reading it at all, because I did. I think what the issue is that because it's Charlotte Bronte, and because I went into it with high expectations, and because now I became used to Charlotte Bronte writing just on another level of brilliancy, both in terms of prose quality and storytelling, I mean, because of all of those reasons, I just came up disappointed by The Professor. So please keep that in mind as I go on now into this video, just giving free rein and ranting about all the things that I did not like in this book. Now, to start off with a summary, just to give you an idea about the premise of the book if you haven't read it, it's the first story by Charlotte Bronte, and it tells us about the life of William Crimsworth, who is an orphan. He has no prospects, no inheritance, and he was raised by his wealthy uncles, but he pretty much disagrees with them on basically everything. And one day when they were discussing the future of William, they insult his father for being a tradesman. And William, on an impulse or just out of spite, decides to become a tradesman himself. And so he cuts all relations with his uncles and travels north to meet with his estranged brother and works for him for a bit. However, this life does not suit William. He doesn't feel that the relationship that he made with his brother it wasn't what he imagined it would be. And he soon found himself seeking a life of independence and freedom. And based on the recommendation of an acquaintance, he moves to Belgium and finds himself there working as an English teacher or as a professor. And it is in his role as a professor in Belgium that the story takes place and starts exploring all the themes that are characteristic of Charlotte Bronte's works. Now, the writing quality in this book, the prose, was just not what you would expect it would be, considering that this is Charlotte Bronte. It is nowhere near the powerful language of Jane Eyre or Villette or even Shirley. And Charlotte Bronte herself says something to that effect in the preface to the book. She says that she tried in this book to keep her language subdued and less ornamental because she wanted to keep things realistic. But I don't think this writing style suits her very much because it detracts from the poetic, powerful language that I know Charlotte Bronte is capable of. And even as she tried to be practical and subdued, there were a couple of passages here and there that just showed the poetic power that Charlotte Bronte could have had in this book. However, instead of having like the effect they do in her later novels, here they just seemed out of place because they were popping up here and there, not really fitting into the whole scheme of things. And to be honest, I love reading long passages from Charlotte Bronte where she describes nature and then talks about the characters' feelings and responses either to natural events or to other types of incidents, and especially when they have like conversations with personified images of reason and hope and imagination. I love that. But whenever something like that came up in The Professor, it just felt boring. It felt again out of place. And I think one of the main reasons for that is that a large portion of the book, especially in the beginning, it was not immersive at all, neither in the language nor in the events. I think the pace was quite fast. There was not enough time to enjoy what was going on, to read descriptions, to enjoy the characterization. Everything was done in haste. It seemed as if Charlotte Bronte was not quite sure of herself, just to give us the best she had. And this showed even in the beginning of the book. We get introduced into the novel and into the world of William Crimsworth through a letter that was lying around on his desk. And after we read a copy of that letter, he says, okay, now the recipient of the letter doesn't need to know more about my life, but you, the reader, since I have time on my hand, I'm going to tell you more and more about it. And it seemed very tortured. It seemed as if the narrator himself was not sure of his ability and he's not entitled to tell us the story, and he just wanted to find a reason to tell us this truthful account of a story. And yeah, so I think the story could have done more, could have benefited from the author just taking her time to develop things further and just to give us her best. Now, all of this definitely changes a lot in the second half of the book. Not much, but significantly better. And Charlotte Bronte herself says in one of her correspondences that in the middle and last portions of The Professor, she's writing as best as she can. And of course, you and I both know that that's not true. This is nowhere near the level of writing that we see in Jane Eyre and Shirley, and finally in the last masterpiece, Villette. But it's definitely better than the first part of the book. Now, as for the character, let's start with the narrator of the story, William Crimsworth. Now, to be honest with you right up front, I did not like him. I did not care for him. I did not find myself rooting for his well-being and happiness. And that's because I had a couple of points with his character that I really did not like. First of all, he was obnoxiously self-righteous. He just thought himself to be better than everyone else. He was very judgmental, and the kind of judgments that he made of other people, they were very shallow, based on physical appearances or origins. He was very racist towards the Flemish for no obvious reason, and less so, but still racist towards the French. And I know that we see that kind of judging people based on their appearances in a lot of Charlotte Bronte's work, but usually it's done with nuance and things like the gleam of the eye and the way a person smiled and the way they carried themselves. These things are usually what propel the narrator to make these judgments. But here it was something else. It was something like this person had a big nose or a large forehead and he seemed stupid. It lacked the nuance and the complexity that would justify, at least explain, this kind of judgment. Also, the dichotomy between the Protestants and the Catholics was also quite difficult to get over. Again, I know that usually in Charlotte Bronte's books there are attacks against Catholicism, but here it was done just in black and white and very bluntly and in bad taste. It was like, okay, Protestants, good, Catholics, bad. What's the root and reason for all evils in the world? Of course, the Catholics. What is the reason for everything that is good and fair in the world? Well, of course, the Protestants. So yeah, these things were difficult to read and difficult to get over. And moreover, I think William Crimsworth himself was not a very interesting person to read about. He lacked the depth of a Lucy Snow, and I'm sure that he is just like a male, shallower, less developed version of Lucy Snow, and we don't see him suffering. We don't see him like going through different moods. There's nothing about this guy. He's just a person who thinks himself better than everyone else, and with strokes of luck and after a few hiccups in his life, just everything falls into his lap, and it was just not very interesting to read. Now, as for the other characters in the book, like Frances and Hunston and Palette and Mademoiselle Reuter, they could have been interesting, but they just seemed incomplete and at times flat and inhuman characters. Now, this could be one reason for this is that we are seeing them through the eyes of William Crimsworth, who himself is shallow and unable, I think, to appreciate complexity and nuance in characters, or because we don't spend so much time with them that, again, they are just underdeveloped characters. And this applies also to all the minor characters in the book. Now, the last thing I want to talk about is the fact that the Professor is admittedly just a primitive version of Villette. Basically, there is nothing in the Professor that is not reworked one way or another into Villette, whether that be the plot, the characters. But by the way, reading William Crimsworth adjusting to his new life as a professor in the Belgian school, and the way he describes the students and the way that he at first tries to maintain order in the classroom and all of that, it just seemed like I am rereading parts and bits of Villette, but without the brilliancy and the depth of Villette. Also, a lot of the themes, like the idea of exploring solitude while you are alone in a foreign country, morals and values of perseverance and hard work, all of that is there, but again, it's a bit underdeveloped and it gets picked up again in Villette. One glaring example of that is like the exploration of the mental state that is described here as hypochondria. William, for some reason, God knows what, gets sick for 1 week, and he describes it as hypochondria, and he starts contemplating mortality and the meaning of life, but it was done so briefly and in a language so unappealing that you just know that, okay, this is again just another hiccup, he's gonna be fine. And yeah, that happens, it seemed pointless and the story moves on. Whereas in Villette, when Lucy Snow goes into a state of depression or mental lethargy, I mean, just the psychological depth to it is just on another level. There are some feminist sentiments here and there. I think it seemed most obvious when Frances was talking about her ideas about marriage, that a woman should be able to admire and respect her husband, otherwise it's just like another form of slavery, and saying that, of course, is courageous, very courageous in the Victorian period, but again, it was just thrown there and not taken anywhere. It was, again, just a sentiment that was thrown out. The same thing with the struggles between the classes, social restraint, and all the other themes that Charlotte Bronte deals with. They were just there. We see them as seeds, perhaps as evidence that this person, this amazing writer, would pick them up again in the future and develop them to new heights. Now, having said all that, again, I get back to the beginning. I did enjoy reading the book. One, because it's an interesting, nice little story, a pointless story, but an interesting one nonetheless. And also because it was an interesting insight into Charlotte Bronte's early work. It was really interesting to see her first attempt at writing a novel. It's really surprising that this person would, within a year, write something as magnificent as Jane Eyre. Just the amount of improvement that she goes through, both in terms of writing style and in terms of the depth into the characterization and the psychology, it's just astounding. And I'm afraid that the Professor cannot help but lose in comparison with Villette. It's just another version of Villette, and reading it I could not stop myself from associating between the two novels. Perhaps had I not read Villette, I wouldn't have picked up on the many shortcomings that I found in The Professor. Perhaps I would have enjoyed it much more than I did. Now, to answer the question in the thumbnail, whether this should have remained unpublished, first of all, I am immensely grateful that The Professor was not successful in the lifetime of Charlotte Bronte, because had any publisher in London or England agreed to put it out into the world, we wouldn't have had Villette. And Villette is such a masterpiece that I don't imagine just Charlotte Bronte not writing it. Perhaps she would have written something else, but I mean, I love Villette, so I'm clinging to it. But at the same time, I'm also grateful that The Professor was published after her death. One, because, as I said, it's just interesting to see Charlotte Bronte in her first attempts at writing a novel, to see her to see her just putting the seeds of what she would later on develop. Also, it means it's another novel from Charlotte Bronte, and who would complain with that? And thirdly, because, as I said, it's an interesting story, it's a nice read, so why not? Do I recommend it? That depends. If you've read nothing from Charlotte Bronte, then I wouldn't recommend you starting with The Professor. Perhaps you should start with something like Jane Eyre. I mean, it tells you much more about who Charlotte Bronte is and what she's capable of. But if you're intimidated by how long Jane Eyre is, and if you want something that is short and easy to read, then okay, why not start with The Professor, because it's, I think, between 200 and 300 pages. The version that I read was 200 and about 80 pages or something like that. So it's a pretty easy, straightforward read. But what I would like you to keep in mind is that this is not what Charlotte Bronte is all about. You can just, as I said, just see these things as the beginnings of something that will be developed later on into greater things. And the writing style would definitely improve immeasurably just within this year between the writing of The Professor and writing Jane Eyre. If you have read everything else by Charlotte Bronte, then of course, why not just give The Professor a try and see what you think. You might like it more than I did. And speaking of that, if you have already read The Professor, what do you think of this review? Do you think that I was being too harsh on it, or do you agree with what I said? Just tell me about the things that you liked and disliked in the comments. So if you like this video, please give it a thumbs up, and if you enjoy this kind of thing, do consider subscribing to the channel. I'll be making more and more reviews and book chats like this one. And as you can see, perhaps I'm starting this channel. It's a new thing, it's a new project, and I do need all the support that I can get. And finally, if you have been watching so far, thank you.